Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
So we're here today with Dr. Bret Collier. He's a professor at Louisiana State University, does a lot of work specifically focused on wild turkeys, not only the eastern subspecies, but has also done quite a bit of work with Rios as well. Bret, thanks for coming on today.
Glad to be here today.
Yeah, really happy to have you.
And so, the reason we wanted to have you on, Bret, as we were talking about just a moment ago, is that there's been a lot of discussion recently about density dependence in turkeys. And we've had some other guests that we've talked to that have noted that at a statewide scale, or even if you look at a region-wide scale, there are these patterns that emerge where it looks like, during early restocking or shortly thereafter, these populations experienced a period of rapid growth. And then, they're now, a lot of them at least, are stabilizing or decreasing to an extent. Looks like somewhat of a typical density-dependent relationship. And I know you were also a co-author on a paper several years ago with Mike Chamberlain and Mike Byrne that talked a little bit about that topic.
Yes. So thinking back to kind of historic restoration, we went from a situation where there weren't turkeys on the landscape. They just weren't there. And in any species where you get an opportunity to reintroduce it, you tend to see rapid growth. I mean that's generally the assumption under density dependence is that resources are a limiting factor, and if the organism hasn't been there previously and then you put it there, we generally across most wildlife species tend to see a rapid increase in population size. Turkey reintroductions showed that. But turkey reintroduction, and over time, the general pattern, and I want to separate pattern from process in this discussion. The general pattern we have seen is we put turkeys on the landscape in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. Populations grew really, really fast, and then we saw the population numbers or the indexes for various population sizes or population parameters kind of turn over in the early 2000s. And now, as probably most of the people listening, we've seen these kind of ongoing regional declines for wild turkeys. And there's been a lot of discussion about density dependence and how it impacts or could impact turkeys. So in 2015, I guess we probably started writing it in about 2013, Mike Byrne, who was working with Mike Chamberlain and myself, kind of looked at a bunch of data sources that were available and on wild turkey population size, estimates of recruitment, poult per hen indices, count data from the breeding bird survey. And most of these patterns that we saw mimicked generally what you would think with a population that is showing some sort of a density response. And our original hypothesis at the time was that potentially there is some sort of density dependent feedback that is occurring in wild turkeys that would cause them to act like any other species, deer or whatever we would think would act, right? They can eat themselves out of house and home, so to speak. We do think about the old, the old history of density dependence, everything from researching aphids in, little, in situ experiments where they see how many they can have until to the kaibab deer herd, right? And to Leopold talking about the the green fire in the wolf's eyes, right? I mean, that's a story about density dependence.
And the George Reserve in Michigan.
The George Reserve in Michigan. Actually, not but 20 miles north of where I'm sitting right now.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. We hike up there. And we wrote this paper, and at the time, and both the mics will tell you, I had some reservations about density dependence and its potential impact on turkeys. And some of that, I think, for me, came from the fact that predominantly my experience was at that point working with Rios. I mean, I'd been in Texas for over a decade, and Rios are a environmentally driven species. They're boom bust. We've shown that very clearly, that if you get rain, Rio Grande turkey poults spring out of the ground. They don't even need nests; they just show up, right?
And weather happens regardless of density, so that's a density independent factor.
Very density, yes, absolutely. Density independent, and you have these big pulses of Rios, and then they kind of trend out over time. And I got to thinking about, and many of us have had this discussion, and I'm probably an outlier, to be honest with you, in the wild turkey field, and probably in wildlife in general, in that I don't think that density dependence operates on wild turkeys how it operates on most other species, like deer being, some sort of big cervid being the general example. And my thought process on this has kind of matured over time, because I'm willing to say when I'm wrong. And I mean, I've done a lot of research with VHF tags on turkeys that now with GPS, we figured out kind of what I was saying was wrong in the past, and I'm okay with being wrong. And so, wisdom grows. And I'm not sure that the patterns that we see in wild turkey population trajectories are a density response. And the reason behind that is that population growth trajectories were in absence of harvest. And we whenever birds were put on the landscape, harvest was restricted significantly. And then as the populations grew, harvest started to become a larger and larger part of the mortality process for males, at least over time. And I'm going to leave females and fall harvest kind of out of the equation. And then all of a sudden, at the same, and not at the same time, because we had a density effect, we'd expect to see it at the same time. There's one turkey population in the United States, right? There's not a population in Louisiana, and a population in Arkansas, and a population in Missouri. They don't understand state lines. So all of a sudden, we started to see these turnovers occur, but they were occurring at different times. And I can't reconcile in my head the fact that the turnover in, Arkansas occurred at a different time than the turnover in Alabama, than the turnover in Tennessee, until you go back and start looking about when individuals were restocked, right? Because then you've got staggered entry, staggered restocking activity, and you got rapid population growth without anybody being harvested. And then we start hunting them, populations continue to go up, and then hunting kind of lags. And I'm not criticizing hunting. I want to be real clear about this here. We're talking about process as opposed to pattern. Hunting and those kind of activities lag, and then everything turned over, but hunting still went up. The number of birds shot kept going up, even as the number of turkeys that were theoretically available went down. So we've got this weird disjoint thing coming along in turkey population biology, in that we've got a pattern, and everybody ascribes the process to this hand-wavy, nebulous concept of density dependence. But to have density dependence, we have to have a demographic parameter that it operates on. What would that be? In most studies evaluating density dependence, it's been lack of resource availability, which has then led to lack of foraging availability, which then led to mortality. That's, or some either, generally density dependence, I shouldn't say mortality. It operates on recruitment first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the female can't get enough to eat. She doesn't bring off as many offspring. The offspring don't survive. And then you get to the point where it operates on the female can't get enough to eat and she dies. That system doesn't work for turkeys. What parameters should it be operating on? We don't find turkeys dead on the landscape, just starved to death, right? Most demographic parameters, generally speaking, like nesting rates, are lower, but not a ton lower than they were in the 80s and 90s. I mean, juveniles rarely nest. Juveniles rarely bring off offspring. So most adult females are being bred and are nesting. Clutch sizes are about the same as they have been for the last 40 years. I mean, the turkeys basically have somewhere between 10 and 12 eggs. We know that. Polled survival seems lower, but I don't know that that's a density response so much as it is a habitat availability response. And maybe that's the back end of this, which we'll get to in a minute. But
Brett, one question when you're describing, how it's acting on it, with the thing that you guys presented in the burn et al. Paper that you were an author on, that was what you were using the poult data to show, right? That over time, the poults per hen were declining. So are you saying that?
Was it, hold on, Marcus, was it the poults per hen or was it the poults or the hens without poults increasing?
Hens without poults went up. Poults per hen went down in that paper in both of them.
And hen survival went up, right?
Hen survival went up, right?
Okay.
Yes, yeah. Hen survival was one of the things that, generally speaking, has gone up.
So the hypothesis y'all had at that time hinged on there maybe being inadequate availability of nesting habitat. So you still had some hens
or brooding,
hens that,
right?
Yeah, the hens that were successful, that occupied suitable habitat, were still producing poults, but there were some that were maybe getting pushed out into marginal areas as the population expanded. Is that right?
That was roughly it. And Jody Schaap, working at Texas A&M back in the early 2000s, wrote a paper. It was published in one of the proceedings, talking about how these females use space, and saying that these females didn't want to be near each other, and maybe and this goes back to process. This goes back to trying to figure out what's driving the pattern. That maybe these females were spacing out such that they didn't have to be near each other during nesting, because they were defending a resource, was basically the implicit assumption on that, right?
So the resource, though, that density dependence would act on in that case is space. I think that's one.
Yes.
I think that's one thing that's confusing with a lot of people when I'm hearing them talk, trying to figure out what to think about density dependence. People latch on to food, and it doesn't necessarily have to be food. So
the resource could be space. Absolutely, right?
Okay.
And like I'm not saying that there's not a process. There's not a parameter that it's acting on. But let's think about this in context. Turkey populations didn't peak yesterday. They peaked 20 years ago. Right? I think generally speaking, everybody would agree in the early 2000s. Yet we're talking about density dependence on the back end of a decline. You can't have density dependence when your population is already past the peak and is on a downward trajectory. So you're gonna come back and talk about stochasticity after the peak. We're not in a stable state stochasticity. We're down 1 million birds, I think, is the number.
Well,
right?
One thing I was going to ask you about related to that, Brett, but if the theoretical carrying capacity stayed the same, right?
Sure.
But if we have rapid human expansion into areas and degradation of suitable area for turkeys, could that drive that pattern? Am I frozen?
No, you're fine.
Okay. No, you bumped your mic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It looked like it froze for a minute. So if you if you had a pattern where the carrying capacity was continually being pushed down, wouldn't you end up with a pattern like what you're describing, where you could have it acting on it and it just kind of keeps acting as it moves down?
100%. Absolutely. Okay. But tell that to the people that live in Boston that have turkeys roosting on their houses.
No, I'm with
right? You. I mean, and not all states are affected, are seeing declines. I want to be clear on that, right? I mean, Texas Rios are doing decline. It seems to be predominantly an Eastern problem, as a general rule. But let me back up. So when we think about density dependence in any wildlife, it's nebulous. And there are a lot of people that are going to yell at me about this, but nobody can tell me what carrying capacity is for any species in the United States, period.
You mean as far as a number?
K. What is K? Nobody, when you think about the old Lochte-Volterra formulas, nobody knows what it is, right? Nobody knows what the functional response looks like. We have a whole bunch of theoretical logistic growth curves and Ricker curves and mathematical garbage that's well beyond the extent of probably what any of the listeners care about, right? But nobody knows what the functional form should look like. Nobody knows what the operational parameters that we should be focusing on should be. All everybody ever says is, oh, it's a density dependent effect. What if we're wrong? Fine, let's assume that it's a density dependent effect. What if it has nothing to do with, say, resources that affect female output? What if it's resources that affect male fitness, that affect male breeding success? We don't tend to look at turkey populations in general, or to turkey populations specifically, from a perspective that questions status quo. And density dependence has long been status quo in wildlife ecology because we see patterns. And then we infer process. I don't know what too many turkeys is to where you'd have to have a density dependent response. There's been some recent work that says that these birds will go out for nesting in some sort of order where it's separated by about 3 or 4 days and they don't generally overlap. There's been some work that's been done recently in the Southeast saying that these birds tend not to go back to the same spots where they nested between nesting attempts, even if they were successful. There's been some anecdotal evidence that shows they go to the exact same locations, right? There's some work that I'm involved with that's looking at, how much space these birds actually use. How much area does a flock use within a given year? It's density dependence is the easiest thing. What's that thing? It goes back to the old Larry Flint Supreme Court hearing, right? Whenever him and Falwell were going back and forth. Density dependence is the easiest thing for everybody to ascribe something to, and the hardest thing to prove, because there's no metric we can measure, which makes it a useless standard, right? I'm not saying that there aren't potentially density effects, but I don't think that population declines in wild turkeys are strictly a density dependent response, because historically in density dependent studies, they were done in absence of any other removal activity, not in the presence of. And ours are in the presence of harvest. We shoot, 30-40% of the birds on the landscape every year. That's probably, maybe that's, depending on the area. Let's say it's between 20 and 40%, okay? Or even 10 and 30, it doesn't matter. We remove 1/3 of the mouths on the landscape every year. Does density dependence thus only operate on females who are looking for nesting habitats? That was that was a hypothesis that I believed in, that we were lacking enough available, appropriate quality is the term that gets thrown around, but quality vegetative cover on the landscape, until I looked at 900 nest sites. And there's no rhyme or reason to any of them other than they like to have a little bushes around them, right? So I think about birds that are in Louisiana. I think about some of our highest nest success rates came in regions that were more fragmented than our big national forest blocks, which should be where we see higher nest success rates. You know, so I'm struggling, and I'm enough of a professional, at least I hope I am, to say I might be wrong. I mean, it could be a density dependent effect, right? And I'm very comfortable being wrong, but I'm struggling in identifying it.
Yeah, I think you're making some good points, and you have to have testable hypotheses, but it's also important to have competing hypotheses. And you know, I think we've probably belabored that point by now on here, Will. I think, but having different viewpoints that are challenging each other. That's one of the values of having a lot of scientists working on an idea or a species or whatever, is that we're constantly challenging each other to, do good work and think about things differently. And that's good. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you about this. One of the things that's kind of bouncing around in my head when I'm thinking through what you're saying, if we have these patterns that are fairly consistent across states from the restocking efforts and all that, do you have, I guess one of the things that Will and I have struggled to think through is what is a competing hypothesis for why it would be that consistent? So
removal of males.
So you're saying like the onset of hunting season frameworks that allow more harvest was consistent in terms of timing?
Yeah, generally speaking, they're fairly consistent. And if you look at the hunting season timing and the activity of hunters, and again, this is not a against hunting thing, I mean, even as populations started to decline, hunting continued to increase, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, turkey hunting is one of the premier sports in the United States. I mean, we can all holler about how it's deer hunting, but it's turkey hunting. I mean, people, mm-hmm. it's one of the few things that's still growing. Maybe the response is tied somewhat to males as opposed to females. That's a competing hypothesis, mm-hmm. right? We look at where these birds are, like a female takes her brood. Maybe the density impact is space that meets a specific thermal cover gradient and its availability on the landscape, for instance. Mm-hmm. Potentially there's an angle for nest depredation and scavenging, which are different ecological processes that we've tended to lump biologically in our field that I'm personally trying very hard to separate right now in our field. But mm-hmm. maybe there's some change where we're actually not seeing a density dependent response on the organism, but we're seeing a change in the suite of predation pressures that mm-hmm. affects the organism, which is a independent response in my mind, not a dependent mm-hmm. response. Because so there are, Marcus, to your point, absolutely, there are a host of potential testable hypotheses that we can look mm-hmm. at, and I'm very comfortable being wrong. But mm-hmm. the bigger question I have is, what if I'm right? Mm-hmm. So what if it's not just because, and I guess I don't want to say it's a criticism. My thoughts with regard to the ubiquitous application of density dependence is that it's a catch-all for things we don't know the answer to. Mm-hmm. And those are the answers we really need to find out, because if it is a density effect, then, for reduction in resources due to reduction in available space is what you had said earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Fine. If that's it, that's a solvable problem from the turkey conservation perspective. Mm-hmm. But we have been implementing those actions for a long time, and we're still seeing the same decline. We've been trying to put quality nesting habitat on the ground for a long time. We are, right? Mm-hmm. But we're still seeing declines. We've been trying to put quality brooding habitat on the landscape for a while. We are, but we're still seeing those declines. All of that was done under we need to create more because there's not enough of it, density dependent paradigm. What if it's not those? Mm-hmm. What if it's something else? People will throw out things like disease. right? You hear a lot about disease and blood parasites and black flies and all this other kind of stuff, highly pathogenic AI. Those are acute processes, right? They're not really a density effect in turkeys because turkeys don't have these massive aggregations like you wouldn't say waterfowl, where they get avian cholera, where you just have a massive die-off type of thing. So I think that, I don't know if it's thinking outside the box. I don't want to say that, but I think that all the things that we ascribe a density response to are things that we're already trying to and have been doing. More fire on the ground, creating more habitat, managing timber harvest, working on creating edge, trying to take lands that were in agricultural production and move them back into, conservation, action. All these things are things that we're doing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we just flipped the coin too far, and now we got to move back a little bit and get more land in there. But if I'm right, we're spending a lot of time and effort talking about a thing that might not be the driver. And I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. I'm saying if my option also needs to be evaluated. So and Mike Chamberlain and I, you guys know Mike. I'm sure he's either been on or coming on, right?
Yeah, we had him recently. Yep.
He and I are not at odds on this. We disagree professionally. But I ask him the same question: what does it operate on? And his response is resources. My response is that's not fine enough. So, and we're thinking about these type of problems together, as are most of us. I think you guys had Coulter, I think was probably on. You talked to Mark McConnell, you talked to Adam Butler. Adam and I we went, I got to call him later today, actually. We've been round and round on this on phone calls and text messages, and he does not understand how I don't think it's density dependence, and I do not understand how he can't accept there might be an alternative. So, and I'm not saying that density dependence is incorrect from a theoretical aspect, but nobody would assume that it applies to any of the Western birds. I mean, Rios are precipitation driven. Generally, so are Goulds. Merriam's fall in between. Generally, they want it to be drier earlier, right? So that nesting gets out. But this density dependent paradigm came from that 2015 paper, probably, and is applicable generally only to Easterns. And I don't understand how we can apply it to one and not think that it's applied to all, because we're still having land conversion across the Western United States, right? We see the same issues, and we're addressing the same issues for different subspecies, but we're only saying that density dependence applies to one. And that's a struggle that I've had, because we think about this stuff, right? This is we all get together and drink a beer, at a conference or something, and it turns into a discussion of science and what we think and what we don't think. And I can't reconcile it in my head yet.
Yeah. So I guess one area that I struggle with a little bit on that, Brett, is as far as your hunting hypothesis is, I'm not as familiar with data from other states, but the best available data, and that's a key word right there, right? Best available, because it may not be that great on hunter numbers that we have, like in Alabama, for instance, is that turkey hunter numbers are declining.
Now. And again, the hunting hypothesis is one of many hypotheses, right? So it's not, I don't want anybody to think Brett says it's hunting, okay? We're talking about science here, but they're declining now. They weren't declining 20 years ago. They're going up. And they kept going up, and then they turned over, half a dozen years ago? So after the population turned over, turkey hunting numbers, kind of turned over, but turkey hunters across the continent, across the United States, their numbers are stable or increasing.
Okay.
Right. I mean, you're gonna have local variability, but yeah. So, and some of that was in the status report. We've seen a pretty big decline in fall hunting. Like very few people fall hunting, and this is something that I will make a stand on if you guys really want to stand. I am not a fan of shooting females in the fall. Period. End of story.
Especially given the situation, why would we be shooting females anyway?
Yeah,
we just had that discussion.
Yeah, it's pretty. That is as direct as I can get. I can't. It's not a Bret says no, but if Bret had to say, Bret would say no.
And I mean, I think you could lump bearded hens in the spring in there too.
There's that is I think we all generally know that the harvest of bearded hens is basically such that if a mistake is made, law enforcement doesn't have to arrest somebody. My problem with that is if a mistake is made, you probably shouldn't be turkey hunting.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that with Coulter. I mean, we expect deer hunters to be able to make differentiations of 1 inch of beam or something like that, or why can't we expect the same of turkeys?
Well, and then in some states, they're distinguishing between a Jake and a Tom. So
that's even more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I was to tell you your deer example. Kennedy, my daughter, and I were sitting in the deer stand on the farm in Illinois at our ground blind, and I had an antlerless only tag. And of course, when you have an antlerless only tag, all you have in front of you is bucks, right? all we had the whole morning was bucks, and a spike came out. And it's in Illinois with my landowner permits. It's 3 inches or less. That's considered an antlerless deer. He was probably 4.5, 5. And he's like, "Oh no, Daddy, he looks to be about 3 inches." I'm like, "I'm not getting the loppers. I'm not shooting that deer and getting the loppers out." So but we assume that people who hunt deer can make these value judgment decisions, but for some odd reason, we've arbitrarily not decided to apply that same thing to turkeys. And I'll leave it at that. Mm-hmm. So
I wonder if that's a shot across the bow at the intellect of turkey hunters.
No, not at all.
Not by you. I'm talking about like the regulatory frameworks, thinking that turkey hunters can't tell the difference in a hen's head and a.
I normally think about it the other way.
I think probably, and again, I don't know, and somebody like Bill Healy would really have a good insight on that. I think probably what it was whenever turkey populations were booming. Because for all recreational species, whenever turkey populations were booming, we wanted to provide the most available opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I love turkey hunting. I mean, I'm lining up places I'm turkey hunting for this next year right now, and I can't wait to get out and do it. But I think that as we progress, thoughts need to be focused in on we probably shouldn't be shooting females, removing the 3,000 females in a fall season. Oh, well, it probably doesn't have population trajectory impacts. Well, yeah, it does. It does now. It may be you didn't used to, whenever production was higher and that kind of thing. But those type of things do come into play now. So what is exciting about this is, because I don't want to just ramble, when we think about what drives turkey populations, whether density dependence is or is not a factor is irrelevant. Okay, it's figuring out what's driving the change, what the process is that's driving the change in the demographic parameters. Because density in and of itself is nebulous. Nobody can say you've got 36 birds in this 7 square kilometer area. Your production is going to be 1.3. And you've got 42 birds in this area, and your production is going to be 1.25. Mm-hmm. Like, that doesn't exist. It will never exist, right? So what it's doing is it's forcing a lot of us that are active in the field to critically think about the data that we collect and the information that we are proposing to collect, such that we can hopefully better hone in on what may or may not be impacting these birds, whether it's available space on the landscape, brooding cover, nesting cover, availability of adult males, availability of adult females, genetic relationships on the landscape, any of those things. It's us thinking about this as a group and having a diverse set of opinions is really causing all of us to think critically about what we're doing. And that's the real benefit of having so many people talking about turkeys and having differences of opinion in my mind. So I may be wrong. I'm perfectly comfortable being wrong. I'm also perfectly comfortable not being wrong because either way, it benefits the resource.
Yeah, that's what it's
about. The solution benefits the resource.
Well, Bret, just to zone in on like just to try to narrow it down so we can have some good discussion about this. When I think about the Texas populations, which you've done a ton of work on and know it inside and out, when you have rainfall, why does it below the why did I think you said the pulse just come out of the ground?
Yeah.
Why does that happen? Is it just vegetation structure, or is there something other than that? I'm just thinking about like it just as a bed of forbs everywhere.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you go and look at some of these. I wish I had a way to show you the pictures. You go look at some of these landscapes in, think like I-35 kind of west, right? Not, that's kind of the core Rio range. I mean, obviously they get over on the east side of that, but down into South Texas, you look at these landscapes. They're dry. I mean, they're dry, and it's hard for these birds to. It's not hard. These birds want to nest in places that have cover, and there's not a ton of it. And the old joke in Texas, I suppose, is the drought starts the day after the last raindrop fell. It's what my buddy Todd always tells me. But then when you get rainfall at the right time, the ground explodes, and it explodes in vegetation, but it also explodes in insects, right? And I think what happens is you get this pulse, right, which is extremely common. You get this reproductive pulse due to the fact that now there's cover everywhere where there wasn't before, and there's food everywhere. But it's short-lived, because drought starts, it's not, you don't get continuous rains in Texas generally. So you see these pulses, and then you may go 2 or 3 years without a pulse. I can remember we had a pulse in 2005, another one in 10, and then 14 maybe, where we just saw birds just blow out of the landscape. And then the problem in those systems, these kind of environmentally driven systems, right? Female survival becomes paramount. Because the females have to survive, because if they don't bring off a nest, they've got to be around the next year. So
they
a lot of those
live
females
for one go, even if they may live 5 years.
Yeah, so they often choose in the dry years not to nest. That's not. I mean, that's an environmental response. It's hot and it's dry. I'm not going to put energy, physiological expense into nesting. I'm going to live and hope that it gets to. And we've got some evidence that they do that. A good bit of evidence. But transition that to your southeastern United States. Our climate, and people may not realize it, but the climate in the southeastern United States especially, it's pretty constant, right? We don't get these huge pulses of rain where we're in this huge drought where we haven't had rain for 7 months, and then we get this massive pulse. No, I mean our environment is stable within bounds. So Easterns, they've grown up, for lack of a better word, they've grown up in a system that's pretty constant when you think about it from an environmental stochasticity perspective. And then Rios, their system's totally different. They've grown up in a system where if it rains, they're going to make babies, and if it doesn't rain, they're not. And that's just that the decision is made. So almost being a strong word here, a high percentage of adult female eastern wild turkeys will attempt to nest every year. If it doesn't rain in Texas, being in the core Rio range, probably that goes for Oklahoma and probably Kansas. If they don't get rain, most of them will not nest, is what most of the data shows. They will choose to just live as opposed to nesting. And that's an environmental effect in my eyes. Now, go ahead. But it also leads into some of the things we talked about earlier, like availability of vegetation and availability of resources.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, just following up, and I'll let you continue on with what you're saying. I had this discussion with Mike Chamberlain once. I don't recall what the circumstances were. It may have been on the other podcast or
Mhm.
something. I'm not sure, but to me, when I'm have an extension role and I go on a lot of properties as I know you guys do, I don't see very often a landscape in whoever's property, which the southeast, most of the land is privately owned. I don't see it very common, especially brooding cover. Just a rich forb dominated community. I just don't see it, and I don't see it on public land very often either. And then I look at the Texas example where essentially you go from nothing, like you're saying, when it's dry, to everywhere is it's basically a foreland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like the whole thing. And, it's probably better nesting cover, but in particular, my mind goes to poult rearing and the abundance of insects. And then I look at properties, a lot of times it's a really large landowner or maybe a group of landowners that are all together, and you have a nice little chunk of land where they're really getting after it. And then they're eat up with turkeys often. Mm-hmm. And to me, I'm just I just want to hear your thoughts on this. We're in a landscape now where we definitely we focus a lot on habitat, but at least from my experience, I don't see it implemented at least widespread across the South. And I'm just curious, based on what you were talking about earlier and keeping in mind these different things, and then your experience in Texas, seeing when you don't have any of it, it's basically a failure for everybody. And then when you have a lot of it, everybody goes all out. And I'm just curious, in the East, if you actually did get aggressive at a large enough scale that it's relevant to the species, would you expect to see that same kind of shift in reproductive success, or I guess it wouldn't be necessarily effort. Maybe they don't have the same cues or whatever to turn it off completely, but would you still see this or expect to see this boom? So in other words, if we have listeners out there that may have control over several thousand acres, if they went all in, I mean, could you get that boom, and could you do it consistently since the environment is more consistent than it is in Texas?
I would think the answer is probably yes. It's hard to speculate across what impact private land, what the boom would look like across 17 or 18 states. But I wonder what the definition of all in is. I mean, are we not already all in? And I mean that. I mean, what I think of the most recent number I saw was 4 or 5% of the United States population hunts. All right. Mm-hmm. So that means corollary, 4 to 5% of the land on the landscape, maybe 10% is available for us to go all in on. Mm-hmm. Right. The rest of it's owned by people who are disenfranchised. Have we already gone all in on those lands? And is the focus, does it need to not be the lands that we're already in on, but it does need to be figuring out a way to go all in in other places? We're probably already, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say there are definitely landowners that they don't think about anything other than turkeys, and they've gone all in. And those are the ones that I kind of think of as those little pockets where they really got them. And then I go on a lot of people's land that are asking me to give them advice, technical advice or whatever. And they don't have anywhere that I would say a brood would have a reasonable, and they want to have turkeys.
Right.
So and that's where we're trying to get them to change that.
I got you.
And I just see it across more of the landscape. We have given, depending on where you're at, maybe 90% of some of these states are privately owned, and then some proportion of those are own it because they want to hunt or they have a hunting interest in it. And then, we're kind of dwindling down, like you're talking about, to the turkey enthusiast. May not be it may not be the majority of that 90%, but I think it's a chunk of it. And I'm wondering, is that how much of it is that problem that we don't have a landscape now where we have enough continuity in the all-in approach where we're making sure they have really high quality nesting and brooding and all the things that the resources that turkeys need to be successful. Do we just have a fragmented landscape, not necessarily a natural area that's not developed, but in suitable community structure from the plant community that we would expect turkey productivity to be high?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I mean, we've outside of the initiation of this talk for density dependence, I mean, we've spent careers, all of us have, looking at identifying what vegetation conditions need to be produced, how we can produce it, what methods we can use to produce them, and where are the best places to produce them. And I think that, I mean, if we went all in, whatever that is, right? Which I'm down, right? I mean,
everybody would define it differently.
So. Yeah, but I got 3 acres in front of the house that I'm going to burn this spring because I burn it every spring, right? But if we went all in, I mean, it can't have a negative impact, right? It's either going to be neutral or positive, and the expectation, I think, would be that it would be positive. I think that because I work with a lot of private landowners as we all do, I think that targeted all-inness is going to be super important, to coin a phrase, right? In that there are areas where we're not going to have success. We're just not. And by having our focal areas where we can have success, be given additional attention, I think that provides the most long-term benefits. I mean, at the end of the day, all of us would agree that more higher quality vegetative communities on the landscape that are good for turkeys are good for everything. They're good for deer, they're good for quail, they're good for songbirds, they're good for, amphibians, they're good for, your reptiles, they're good for wildlife. And I do not disagree a bit that by putting more of that on the landscape, we would probably have a positive impact on turkeys. 100%. And I don't think that anybody would say that that's not correct.
Well, it's not, it may not solve the problem,
but it would help.
It's certainly not going to hurt them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and the more, I mean, the more that we can do with private landowners is that's better in all cases. I don't know. I don't have a good feel for what it would take. I think about the relationships that are currently ongoing between the public, large NGOs, state wildlife agencies, have people who are putting putting habitat on the ground consistently and regularly. I mean, Marcus, I'll defer to you because this is more of your day to day than mine is, but it would provide, anytime we could provide more quality, good vegetation on the ground, would provide a stronger buffer against whatever impact it is that we're seeing that's impacting wild turkeys. And maybe that is the impact. I don't know. But it would provide more of a buffer in my view. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think also what I'm picking up from you, Bret, is your argument would be, if we did that and we kept current harvest rates where they are, that yes, we would probably see greater abundance across the landscape. But if we increased harvest rates commensurate with the increase in K, if you will, relative to this density dependence discussion,
sure,
that we would probably see the same downward trajectory in populations.
Maybe.
Yes, maybe. No, and I don't mean to be wishy-washy, right? Because I mean,
I think we've kind of gotten the audience ready for wishy-washy because it's really hard. It's really hard to know anything for with any relative certainty. But
I'm 100% certain that somebody will not like something I've said today. How about that? No, but I mean, your point though, Will, it's well made. Turkey conservation and management is ridiculously complex. And we tend to, and I've said this in meetings before, we tend to build management around the deer model, right? And in deer, let him go so he can grow. And we need older bucks so that they can breed the females. And that's fine. Okay. Except that you're like year and a half bucks are doing, I think, saw some Randy DeYoung's where it's like 50% of the breeding and everything. Okay. Awesome. Okay. But we tend to try and ascribe those type of models to upland game birds way too much, right? We're dealing with a bird that's the only species, I think, maybe capercaillie, but it's the only species in the United States that we technically hunt during their breeding season. Right? And people say, oh, we hunt deer during the breeding season. Come on, they're brown land rats, okay? Yeah. We're talking about something totally different. We hunt them during the breeding season. We hunt them as early as possible. We hunt them for a long time. Over time, female reproductive effort has stretched out temporally to where it could be almost 5 or 6 months, where we have nests being put on the ground all the way into August in some cases, right? When it should be fairly compacted. We've got a system where we're dealing with the species that we've restored, and now we're trying to figure out what the optimal balance between annual reproduction, annual survival, and annual take is. And I mean, we don't worry about that in most species, right? Quail maybe being the exception. I mean, we don't know how many deer there are in the United States. Nobody thinks about how many deer you've got whenever they set the hunting season. And if they say they do, it's a farce. But we need to start thinking about those type of questions with turkeys, because if we're going to unravel what's actually driving these declines so that we can adjust it, then it increases the complexity of the questions we have to ask, right? We used to just go out and say, oh, look, looks like there's plenty of veg on the ground, and, it rained in January. And I also weighed these birds in January, and then I regressed what date they nested by how much they weighed 4 months earlier. And look, there's a relationship. That doesn't cut it anymore for us, right? That's me picking on myself because I wrote that paper. We need to be asking the hard questions and doing the really hard manipulative experiments to see what does and does not impact this bird. Because too often, and I am totally guilty of this. Yeah, I am guilty of this. I will say this. We hem and haw around the edges, right? We do another nest survival study. I guarantee you nest survival is going to be between 0 and 1. It's probably going to be about 30%. Okay. We do another female survival study. We do another brood habitat selection study. All those are great and all those contribute, but they're not hard questions. Some of the things that are going on now where states are making regulatory adjustments and monitoring the impact of those regulatory adjustments, those are hard questions that states are trying to answer because they are typically not viewed by the hunting public as important, or they are viewed by the hunting public as a reduction in opportunity, and they're not viewed by the public as the state trying to identify what may be a driver that they could use to manipulate turkey populations better in the long run for long run recreational opportunity. Those are the hard things we need to start doing. We need to start experimenting. We need to start going out and going to areas where we can, and during hunting season, say, for example, removing males and seeing from a mixed flock of males and females, and taking out half the males and seeing how that impacts reproduction. We need to go out and look and see at some of these landscape scale vegetation management actions and really get down to, does doing this really impact populations, not over a 2-year master's project, but over a decadal cycle.
Yeah.
And the problem with those is they're hard. Yeah. They're hard. They're expensive. We don't have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service backing us, right? I mean, there are more. Mike and I laugh about this a lot. There are more endowed chairs in waterfowl biology in the United States than there are professional turkey researchers. And there's a whole bunch of Fish and Wildlife Service people who do nothing all day, every day, but manage waterfowl conservation action in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There's less than, I would say, 24 people who study turkeys full time.
Yeah. And to clarify for the listeners, that's because waterfowl are a migratory species, so the federal government is invested in pouring money into that resource.
Right. We don't have that backing us. For turkeys, it's at the state level, and any coordination occurs between guys like us.
Mm-hmm.
Us calling each other and being like, hey, how are you going to set your transmitters up this year so we can be sure our data match, so that we can build off of that kind of stuff, right? So we're at a place in wildlife conservation as a whole, right, where we've answered the easy questions. It's now time to start answering the hard questions. Density dependence is a hard question to answer. Predation and scavenging of nest sites, so nest depredation, is a hard question to answer. Creating brooding habitat is not a hard question to answer. It's not. Implementing the creation of brooding habitat on the landscape, Marcus, going back to what you said, that's a hard thing to do. So we have to start asking these hard questions and then figuring out how to implement the results from those hard answers. Is kind of what I'm thinking. So
yeah, I think that's
boy, if there was ever a soundbite worthy statement.
Yeah, we've had similar discussions multiple times now about in line with what you're saying, where we really need with several issues. We could probably sit here and name them for the next couple of hours if we wanted to really think about it. But we really need, just in biology in general, wildlife biology in general, to have some manipulative things where we're trying to isolate things in a robust experimental design. And it's hard. Yeah, well, especially when you have an animal that is so mobile.
The barriers we usually are presented with related to that is the study is too long, it's too expensive, and we can't make the manipulations that you're asking us to make.
Yeah, and Will and I are involved in a project with Steve Ditchkoff. I'm obviously peripherally to it there at Auburn, where Steve is looking at some feral hog removal activities, because feral pigs have been described as the bane of existence for all wildlife species, and we'll just leave that there for right now. And it's manipulative. So the objective of it was to go out, monitor how these birds are moving, and then remove all the pigs and see if their behavioral changes, right? And then it's manipulative. It's small scale. It's manipulative. I don't want to be hoist on my own petard, but we had Hurricane Laura plow through western Louisiana, plowed through one of my research sites that I've been collecting data on since 2014. So we're working with the Forest Service because they're putting a ton of habitat management on the ground. I mean, tens of thousands of acres every year of everything from timber removal to fire to what you name it in response to the hurricane. We're evaluating the response. It's manipulative only because we happen to already be there. So we have a perfect before-after control impact study, right? Those type of things are rare, and they're hard to do. Mike's doing some work in South Carolina, looking at some unhunted birds and that unhunted SRS group. There's not a lot of manipulation that could go on there. But down the road, there's hopes you do some removals and take some individuals out, right? It's just, they're difficult to implement. And we don't have, as Will said earlier, we don't have the Fish and Wildlife Service backing us, right? Like what goes on in Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Florida. The reason that we have that information is because all of us talk. right? We go to the turkey meetings. We work with, the various NGOs. All of us communicate, and we try to coordinate as much as possible. And I think we've gotten better at that over time, because by all of us coordinating, I think by sharing data as a group, that's strengthened our inferences, and it's allowed for us to reach a wider diversity of landowners and land managers. Because we can see, somebody in North Carolina can see a study and be like, hey, there's some North Carolina data in this study, and there's some Kentucky data, or there's some Georgia data, or there's some Alabama data, or whatever. And it breeds, what's the word I'm looking for here? It shows the stakeholders, no matter where they're at, that what we're doing is applicable to them, even if we're doing it somewhere else. Right. So, I think that's and just, I guess, to go to something you said, Marcus, I think that probably the number one fault for all of us is the getting information out. And I'll say this for me, at least, and we've said this before, like, I don't get paid to talk to people. Like, that's not my job. Like, I don't have an extension and outreach component in my work. So that's not my job. My boss does not want me talking to private landowners. I do it, obviously, because I enjoy it and I know that the long-term benefits, but that's not my role. We, people like me, have to get better at talking to constituents, talking to stakeholders about what they can do and how we can use science to support their management activities. And I answer, if somebody sends me an email or a Facebook message or hits me up on Instagram or Twitter, I will answer them. Right? I may not be quick because I don't check that stuff all day long like some people do, but I will get back to them and I will answer them and try and steer them correctly. And I think that some of this is not just a science perspective; it's also an outreach perspective. We've got, those of us that are doing it have got to be better at getting good information, timely information that supports land and conservation management out on the table. And I think that's the other side of this coin that we're all kind of struggling with right now.
Yeah, and I think that's ties right in. I mean, that's what we're doing right now. That's the whole point of why we wanted you to come on here, to try to connect you to whoever's listening to this and let you voice your thoughts and your experience and everything. I think that is a key aspect, and we're in a time now where there's unprecedented opportunity for outreach, but there's also a lot of clutter that comes with that's difficult to navigate. And I think we as being scientists have a bad rap, and it's probably with good reason in some cases that we don't communicate very well.
I admittedly
with non-scientists.
Do not. Yeah.
So, but I think that's one way that we have to get better about if we want to have broad scale effects on the land and the resource. Those people need to know.
No, I agree completely.
The answers. If when we start to think we've got a handle on things, they need to know that so they can make decisions that are informed by it. So I think that's a really good point, and glad you brought it up. And another thing, our audience out there, if they care about the resource, they're helping us share this, and that we're all playing a part in that and making sure that this content gets to people that can use it and affect the resource. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's it's easy for us, right? We know each other professionally. We're all friends here. I mean, we've known each other. All of us that do this stuff generally have known each other for a long time. So it would be nice if the same relationships were fostered between landowning managers, and the public, to where Kim from Arkansas and Jeff from Louisiana and Kevin from Georgia could get together and talk about what works and what doesn't work and that kind of stuff amongst themselves. I think that some of the social media stuff might be the way that happens, but I think that having the link of something like this that brings them all into a singular spot is extremely useful. So, and I think working with the various NGOs that are engaged in turkey conservation is important. Working with the universities, various universities that are doing, the science, generally speaking, in support with the state wildlife agencies, is important, right? I mean, so there's a lot of state agencies that are putting a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of staff time into, turkey conservation right now. They all, I mean, I would argue that if they're not at the top of the list, there are a few states where turkeys are not either 1 or 1A right now. Especially within the Southeast and, a little bit more once you get into kind of the upper Midwest. So there are a lot of people focused on this issue, and, none of us are, working in a tower. We're all working together, trying to get good answers. So.
Yeah, and that another thing, for folks that are listening, they know this, but that was one of the inspirations for us to develop this podcast. Is there's a lot of great work going on, and like you said, a lot of the people that are carrying out that work, it's not their job to get it out, but that is my job. So it was kind of an inspiration for doing this, is to give people a place that they could go to figure out, well, what is the current status of what's going on in Louisiana or Texas or, wherever you live, just pick it. There's probably some work going on there. And people don't always know what that is. And for that reason, we've really enjoyed having you on here, and, would love to have you back to talk about, some updates on things you've got going on, to keep people informed. From wherever they are, and if they overlap with where you're working, they could get a lot out of that.
Yeah, well, all I'll say is, I mean, obviously I'm at LSU and I work with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife Fisheries, daily. And that's my focal area, obviously. But there are, I would say right now, there are probably more turkey research and conservation management projects going on in the United States than any time in the last, 20 plus years that I've been studying turkeys full time. There's always been research going on where Mike Chamberlain's been. There's always been research going on where I've been. But now there are projects. There's always been research going on in Pennsylvania with, Mary Jo. But now there are, I was just sitting there thinking as you were talking, there are projects that are going on in Pennsylvania. I think there's one kicking off in Maryland, North Carolina with Chris Moorman and Chris Cray up there, and Krista Pacifica just finished up a big project. South Carolina's had ongoing work since mid 2014, 2015, when I started doing stuff over there, and Mike's doing stuff now. There's stuff in Georgia. Alabama's got projects going on. Kentucky and Tennessee, both Zach and Roger from Kentucky and Tennessee, both are doing some work with Brad Cohen. There's Doug Osborne in Arkansas has been doing work. Mike Byrne in Missouri. Coulter Chitwood, the guys down at Oklahoma State are doing work. I've been doing work in Louisiana and Texas. What is the new faculty member's name at Mississippi State? Working with Adam, there's some conservation genetic stuff.
Dana Moore, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I just met Dana. Sorry, I'm doing some conservation genetic stuff in Mississippi. I think there's a project going on in North Dakota right now. I think there's a project in South Dakota. Nebraska, yeah. Andy Little's got a project in Nebraska. I talked to Dave Hocus the other day at Kansas. There has never been a time since I've been working on turkeys where you've had that many state agencies and universities asking turkey questions. It is freaking exciting. So if you think your state's not doing something on turkeys, don't be so sure.
Yeah,
because there is a lot going on right now.
Yeah. It's probably already going on, and if it's not, it's coming soon.
It's coming soon. So So it's an exciting time, and for those of us for those people like me and Mike who have slogged through the long years of being the only two doing turkey research, it's nice to see this big cohort of projects come online because we all talk and we all visit and we all know what each other are doing and we know what works and what doesn't work. And we're able to keep those relationships going so that 3 years down the road, whenever Will calls and says, hey, can I borrow this because I got a student that wants to do X, Y, and Z? Boom, here you go. Or whenever somebody's having a problem and my transmitter shipment got lost and I don't have any tags, which has happened, we all get on a call around and everybody kicks 5 tags to that person so that their project doesn't fail, which has happened, right? So it's an exciting time to be a turkey biologist and be a professional turkey biologist. And on top of that, it should be a super exciting time for the turkey hunting community because there is more information coming your way in the next 5 to 7 years than has probably existed up until now, based on how many projects are going on and how much information they're collecting. So yeah, I mean it's a good time to be doing what we do.
Yeah, and we are really excited, for that same reason, not just to see all the great work that comes out, but to see the impacts it has on the resource, and also gives us some content here. We're trying to chase down the principal investigators in all these projects and get everybody, to come on and tell us what they're doing and what their thoughts on things. So
the only thing I'll add to that is you should really talk to the students. You should. I mean, a 30-minute session with some of the graduate students that are currently active. We've got postdocs, but they're boring, right? I mean, they're just sitting around doing data. But you get somebody like Aaron Ulrey, who's a PhD student at Georgia. You got David, who's just finishing up there at North Carolina State, PhD student. Chad here in Louisiana, who's working in Texas, who does master's with me. He's now doing a PhD in East Texas. You got Will students and Steve Ditchkoff student Travis. You've got Sarah, who's going to be working at a PhD with Bret Collier. I don't know Coulter and them students out there, but
they're recruiting now, I think.
Yeah, they are. Those, I mean, we talk big picture here. Those are the ones that are out ground pounding in a pair of wearing out a pair of boots every year, and they have a very unique perspective. That, to be honest with you, my 2 or 3 days of field checking in on the students doesn't have anymore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't get to go do telemetry and bust through brush and all that stuff. So if you guys get them involved, there'll be some pretty good stories. Make sure if you ever get my student Chad, you ask him about how he started a fire with a rocket, and the fire department got called. So it's an exciting time to be a turkey scientist right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely I have done that some on the Fire University podcast, and I really enjoy talking with students and giving them a voice, and they're so knowledgeable and in the weeds, so to speak. So I think that's a great idea, and I appreciate you commenting on that.
Oh yeah.
Well, we've been taking up your time for quite a while now, so I wanted to give you a chance. Is there any take-home messages or anything that you'd like for people to think about, or anything before we go?
Just briefly, forget all the high-level science that we talked about today. What this really comes down to at the end of the day is working with your state agency and trying to put additional quality, good vegetative components on the ground. That's really what we're talking about from all this perspective is, good land management, good harvest management is good turkey management. Yeah. And there's a host of scientists like those of us here, but also, your local state agency is going to have regional and private land biologists that you can reach out to and work with them on, what you can do to improve turkey conservation, on the landscape. And I would highly encourage that everyone who's listening, try and find out who your local person is and reach out and see what you can, how you guys can get engaged and what you can do to help. And we'll keep working on the large scale regional stuff, and you guys can help us out by keep putting habitat on the ground.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
And for those of you out there, if you don't even know where to start, just send us a message. You can send me one. on social media or email me. I've done that before with Fire University, and I'll help you find somebody local to you wherever you're at. So, all right, guys, anything else? I think we've gone for a while, so we can go ahead and close this down.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come on today.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate having you. Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Bret.
Thanks, everybody out there, for listening. We really appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.